For those of you who don't know me, I'm Steele Stillman. I teach a class called Historical Perspectives in the fall. Various of you have been in that class or are in it. And today we're here to talk with and have a presentation by Eve Sussman. And I'm going to just give you a little bit of information on her up front. And then she's going to do... oh, I didn't know whether... So I'm gonna just do a couple minutes of an introduction on Eve, and then she's gonna give a presentation. Can you hear me now? Yeah. She's gonna give a presentation of some film stuff and some still stuff and whatever, and she'll talk through that, and you guys will know a lot more in 45 minutes. And then we'll do a little bit of a Q&A, she and I, for maybe a couple minutes after that, and then the rest of it, we really want you guys to ask questions and to sort of engage, you know, anything that you have on your mind. You'll have some time to do it, and we'll try and wrap it up well before, you know, say 2:45 or so. So I have some notes here, which are going to be hard for me to read, but I'll give it a shot. Eve Sussman was born in 1961 in London and has lived in various places all over the world. She's a sculptor, filmmaker, installation artist, and basically, as I understand it, sort of views all of those activities as being interrelated. She has a BA from Bennington. Can you guys hear me back there? Yeah? Well enough? She has a BA from Bennington in Vermont, spent some time at Skowhegan, largely studying photography and printmaking. Is it sort of?
But then I was probably a sculptor.
Okay, and well, which is what I was going to say next, that her early work is really as a sculptor, and is what she kind of first became known for. And that sculpture work often involved working in architectural structures and sites, as well as doing, as sort of in combination often with Super 8 cameras and surveillance cameras. She began exhibiting in the early 90s. A key work from that decade, or one of the key works from that decade, which I know Eve is going to show us, is a piece called Ornithology. It was done in 1997. The piece was basically a bird watching tower that was installed in an air shaft behind a Soho gallery. It's sort of a narrow space, if you can imagine, but behind a building. And in this tower, there were also, or around it, there were 12 surveillance cameras that were monitoring the space of the air shaft above. And so it was bird watching, but of course it was bird watching for pigeons, basically. I mean, that was the bird life there. You'll see. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't spoil it. Eve's sort of breakthrough into the larger art world came in 2004 when her short film 89 Seconds at Alcazar was installed in a room of its own at the Whitney Biennial. That sort of installation aspect is something important to keep in mind, because though sometimes people refer to Eve as a filmmaker, often her films are placed in this sort of larger architectural constructs, and that whole thing is also part of the work. 89 Seconds basically offered a peek. It's sort of the subject of it. It offered a peek into what was going on behind the scenes when Velázquez was painting his Las Meninas. So it's sort of, I'm sure you'll also see some of this, right? The camera, everybody's in costume, and the camera sort of tracks through the rooms and spaces that you can't see, obviously, in the painting. It's really a wonderful piece. So Alcazar was made collaboratively, as most of her work since then has been, by an outfit or organization that Eve has sort of put together called the Rufus Corporation. Actually, I've never really known why that name, but maybe we'll hear that too. And her collaborators are artists, writers, performers, craftspeople, technicians, and I know some of these folks, and they're all pretty smart and interesting in their own right. Since then, since Alcazar, she has made other films, including a feature-length film called The Rape of the Sabine Women, which was made in 2007. The story is based on one of the foundation myths of the city of Rome. Maybe you remember this. I think, what was it, Romulus went and okay, you'll tell the story. Okay, I don't want. Yeah, and also I'm eating it. I'm eating into Eve's 40 minutes, so that's not fair, right? Blah blah blah. Roberta Smith did call this piece, which she called it an avant-garde costume drama in 5 acts. But you'll learn more about it. Let's just make sure I've got everything here. So more recently, in 2012, she premiered her most recent public, or most completed piece, maybe, which is called White on White, algorithmic noir. And white on white is all one word, and algorithmic noir is another. Yeah, I'm sure she'll tell you more about why that title, which sort of combines elements of Malevich and obviously computer programming on the other side of that colon. White on White is an immense montage of 3,000 film clips, 80 voiceovers, and 150 pieces of music, all programmed, and I probably have this somewhat wrong, all programmed somewhat randomly by a computer algorithm that she has referred to as, I love this, a serendipity machine.
Not random. Parts are random, parts are algorithmic. That's 10% algorithmic.
You'll get the real dope in about 10 seconds. White on White never screens the same way twice, and its structure thus kind of lets the viewer compose his or her own narrative. So I turn you over to Eve, and here she goes.
Thank you. Let's kill the lights. And Seth, I'll tell you, I'll just yell out if we need more sound or less sound, or if I can't do it myself. All right, so. I usually start with the Super 8 film. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Over the sound of the Super 8. I start with it for a number of reasons. It tells a little bit about my motivation for making this piece, 8 to 9 Seconds at Alcazar, which Steele pointed out was kind of a breakthrough moment for me. But it also has a surveillance quality, and I'm really interested in the possibilities of surveillance, the effect of surveillance, and the fact that we are all surrounded by surveillance all the time. So I'm just going to let this play. This was really not a piece. It's just a little piece of research, a little drawing, a sketch for what became a much bigger piece. So that was my little surreptitious attempt at stealing the soul of Las Meninas. If any of you have ever been in the Prado, I think maybe you'll know what I'm talking about. But I want to talk a little bit more about surveillance. If you live in an urban environment, you're pretty much being watched all the time. There are cameras everywhere. This is not a piece of art. This is the surveillance monitors that are on the platform of the L train in my neighborhood. I've always been fascinated by these, and I think they're kind of crying out for narrative. I even, at one point, made a proposal for MTA public artwork where I would insert narrative into these screens and add in my own text or make one of the screens my own movie, hence creating a film out of the live film that was already happening. Of course, that proposal was rejected pretty obviously. Even before September 11th, that proposal was rejected. But I'm going to show a little bit of this piece. It's called The Whites for a Mystery. And it takes that idea, but instead of using video, again, uses Super 8, a perfect surveillance medium because nobody takes the camera seriously, right? It looks like a toy. It looks like an archaic device. People often don't really even notice you with it. You can carry it in and out through customs in almost any country except maybe Tel Aviv. And I did have a friend have one of my cameras confiscated at the airport in Tel Aviv. It was the only place I've ever had a Super 8 camera confiscated. But this is taking that idea that I mentioned with the subway monitor and doing it in Super 8. These are basically 2 surveillance films. It's really one film, one's playing in real time, one's slowed down 30%, and then a piece of narrative that's inserted between them. I like showing this at the beginning of my talk because this piece that I made, also at the end of the 90s, was using a lot of the same ideas that I'm now using in this piece, Algorithmic Noir, the White on White project, however, completely low-tech. There was nothing really high-tech about it except that I transferred the Super 8 to video, which at that point wasn't very high-tech either, and filmed the text off the wall. But what I like about it is the synthesis that happens where these images start to illustrate the story, and the story starts to illustrate the images, and you start to understand that they must go together, even though in actuality the way that the pictures and the text line up is completely random.
So did you write the text before you made the images?
I wrote the text after I made the images, or kind of during, but really after. I mean, I think I sort of had the text in my head, but that text came into my head while making the images based on what I was seeing and conversations I was having with people in this place, and this was shot in Togo in West Africa. So around the same time as I made this kind of very sort of low-tech algorithmic noir, and never would have called it that at that point, I also did the piece Ornithology that, that Steele mentioned. And I was very much of an installation artist. I wasn't an object sculptor ever, but I was an installation artist, and I have quite a background in construction and building, and part of the way I made my living over the years is by renovating buildings with two of my partners. And so I'm really interested in how we relate to architecture and space, and a lot of what I did at that point, other than shooting Super 8 film, was trying to respond to spaces and magnify something about those architectural places. Sometimes I felt like I was trying to fix something that was wrong. Sometimes I was just trying to magnify something that nobody noticed. There was always an idea about responding to the space. And so I had a chance to do actually what was then my first solo show in this tiny little gallery. It was a 300 square foot gallery. There was nothing redeeming about this place. It had nothing going for it. And I sat up there at night for about a month trying to figure out what the hell am I going to do in this space as an installation artist that works with architecture. And finally, after a few weeks, it was February, and sort of in the darkness, I started noticing there was this cooing sound. And I realized that sound was actually quite loud, and that we were surrounded by pigeons. And so that was the thing that I realized had to be brought into the space. And so there was also an installation element to this, a construction element, which is something I've done a lot. I took out the window, built a tower from the first floor roof up 4 stories and a ramp that went out the window. So, and then placed 12 surveillance cameras all over that air shaft. So there was stuff up in the air. There was a bird feeder. When the public went out on the ramp, you'd see them on the ramp, hence the public becomes under surveillance too. And so you were watching the wildlife, for lack of a better word, in this air shaft in the middle of New York City. There was also a surveillance camera in the windowsill of the next building where a bird was nesting, and those eggs hatched during the show, and they looked like giant dinosaurs on the screen. They were really scary looking. And then that idea I kind of continued a bit in the Istanbul Biennial in '97, where I took that ornithology idea and in a way the Whites Were a Mystery idea and conflated them. And so this is using a mixture of live surveillance and Super 8. What you see there is a guy live getting his hair cut. And I again had about 12 or more cameras all wired in this train station in Istanbul. And then in the middle screen there were texts, one sentence at a time in English and Turkish, that told these 4 stories. Kind of the way I created that narrative in The Whites Were a Mystery. This was creating narrative from what was going on live in the train station with these stories from people I had talked to all around the city. And then just to sort of bring home again the idea of film and sculpture and installation, conflating them again, this is a piece called Endless Lobby, which I created with 16mm film, so there's no video. And it was shot on film and then transferred to this, printed on on a number of prints of 100-foot length that went down through 4 projectors, up around the gallery, up to the ceiling again and down again. This was installed at a place called Smackmelon, which is in Dumbo. Some of you might know it. I installed this piece at another place, a pop-up show that happened in Manhattan on the West Side. And after that, said I was never going to build it again because it was such a pain to build. The projectors are tied together with timing belts, with gears that you can't quite see in the picture, unfortunately. But that's forcing them all into sync. Otherwise, they don't run at exactly the same speed, and that forces the motors to run at the same speed. And so I can show you a little bit of what you see. I think I have a really short version of a demo of this piece. Unfortunately, it's kind of low res. So what you'd see there is these 4 screens, each at about 10-second delays of the endless lobby that was the Portman lobby in the Marriott Marquis in Times Square, where there's just tons and tons and tons of balconies all stacked on top of each other in this massive atrium. And so the life of those balconies is repeated, delayed one after the other. What also happens that was very lovely is because it's Meg's drive to film, is you get kind of a round happening where the sound is repeated in 10-second delays. And so that the audio aspect of that, I thought in a way was almost more interesting to me, or as interesting as the visual aspect of what was happening with this delayed film, and then this sort of crazy mechanism that was driving it all. You can tell there, that's the film going up to the ceiling, hitting a loop, and then going back down through the projectors, going back to the floor and up again. So there was a slight Hitchcock feel about this as you're like watching a guy walk down the aisle, frame after frame, and seeing the action repeated. There's also with this footage, obviously, the obvious surveillance element that's going on as it was all filmed in the glass elevators, riding up and down in that Portman lobby of the Marriott. Okay, I think I'm going to jump forward a little bit. Well, I'm just going to show stills from this short film because this, again, addresses the surveillance idea, but in a slightly different way. This is a film called Solace. It's a 20-minute film. These are stills from it. It was shot from September 11th to about 2 months after. I shot pretty much every day for the first 2 or 3 weeks, and then quite often until about the middle of November. And it really addressed that surveillance idea again, in that when September 11th happened, I don't know how many of you were here then, but I live in a building where we had this incredible view of the towers. That bottom photo in the corner there is pretty much what we saw at our window. And everybody sort of rushed to figure out what they could do, or else felt helpless. And so for me, it just seemed like the only thing you could do was the thing you were good at, and the thing I felt like I was good at was just to keep filming. And so that's what I did. And then I created a film that was actually not a document though. It's it has a kind of a fictional character or a fantasy character, and that is this singer that you see at the mic there, who appears and at some point sings Purcell's music for a while. And then I'll jump forward again. Now we're in 2003, and this is obviously the set for 89 Seconds at Alcazar, which Steele mentioned as kind of the breakout moment. There was all this sort of installation work that I built that sometimes used film and video, sometimes it used mirrors, sometimes it used light, sometimes it used water. But there was a point where I kind of really got sucked into the idea of, well, what if you didn't have to wait for something to happen? What if you could make something happen by using actors? And this was the first time really, or maybe it was actually the second time that that I thought, oh, well, instead of trying to just shoot the cinema verite stuff, which I have been doing with The Whites Were a Mystery and with the Istanbul piece and with a number of these other pieces, waiting for things to happen in real life, what if you actually worked with actors and made things happen? But shot them in the sort of the surveillance mode. So you could be, and what if you, and that was when I did that little Super 8 film Inside the Prado and then brought that home and thought about, well, what if you did surveil this room? What would happen? What's the energy in that room? What's the psychology in that room? And what are the people doing? And one of the most important things I think that's interesting about this painting, and it predates photography by about 300 years, is that it feels extremely photographic, both in the psychology of the characters and the fact that everybody's in mid-gesture. It has to be choreographed. There's no way for anybody to sort of hold those positions for more than a few minutes, even if they're trained performers and dancers. Everybody's coming from somewhere physically and going somewhere. And so figuring out that action was something that seemed like an obvious thing to do. I was like, well, why hasn't somebody done it before? It didn't seem like any big revelation. So I set about to try to create a film of what is Las Meninas, and hence called it 89 Seconds at Alcazar, although the piece is actually quite a bit longer than 89 seconds. And it's installed always as a loop. I never show it as a short film. It always plays as a looping video in a black room. What I love about this still, though, is that to bring in the idea of the video and the photography again, there you see on the monitor the space of the painting without any people in it. And there's something kind of lovely and eerie about that. And so I will just show you guys a little clip from 89 seconds. Continuous take. It doesn't actually break. These are excerpts. So normally it wouldn't go black. It keeps circumnavigating around the room. there you actually see a still from the production day. That's an actor named Jeff Wood that I've worked with a lot. And so each of the actors were actually creating a psychology for their character and sort of an internal monologue. Some of that you even hear when you see the king and the queen in the mirror. And that's, I guess, what we think of as the money shot. And what I love about this is that it actually looks nothing like the painting. People said, oh, you did such a great job casting. Everybody looks so much like the painting. None of our actors look anything like the people in the painting. And everything's wrong, of course. I mean, the dog is flipped over, the Meninas is turned off, the Infanta is turned off to her side, Velázquez is not looking at the camera, and so everything's actually quite wrong. And then what is also important to me about this, I'm going to try to speed up now because I still want to get to a bunch of other stuff, but this is a moment that I sort of show people a lot because I'm really interested in implying narrative, that the audience brings their own narrative to the piece. And this moment within 89 seconds is a piece that people seem to read a lot into. Oh, the widow or the nun, she was actually a widow historically, must be having an affair with the king. What's going on here? Well, what's going on here is there's two people passing each other. But everybody read into that moment, and that implied narrative I thought was so interesting. And so that idea of inserting gesture or inserting text to allow the audience to imply narrative and let them take the narrative where they want is something I've always thought a lot about. Okay, so we had formed this thing called Rufus Corporation, which I'll get to more maybe in the Q&A because it'll take a little too long right now. But I had a group of people that I worked with. I had worked a lot with dancers in the dance theater world in Berlin and sort of experimental theater people, and thought, oh, it'd be so nice to have a company. How come in the art world people don't have companies? And so I thought, I want to have a company. And a little bit, you should be careful what you wish for, because having a company is kind of some responsibility. So this is not really the company. This is a bunch of my friends, as well as the collaborators that make up the corporation, which is really an ad hoc group of people. So there were the folks that worked on 89 Seconds, and then we came together, went actually to Athens, Greece, hired a bunch more actors and crew, and then brought everybody back to the US, and then brought in as many friends as we could because we thought we were going to try to create this fight choreography based on the myth of the Sabine women. If you don't know the story of the myth, Romulus founds Rome, opens the gates of the city. It's a bit like Australia, who comes in, a bunch of criminals and ne'er-do-wells and single men. And so they have this great city, they're building it up, and Romulus realizes the city's going to die out, there are no women. So he hatches a plan. They ask if they can marry the daughters of the neighboring tribe, the Sabines. You know, they're shooed away, you're a bunch of criminals and ne'er-do-wells, you're like Australians, you can't marry our daughters, get out of here. They hatch a plan to steal the women, they do that quite successfully. The women acclimate, become Roman, have children. Years later, the Sabine men decide to come back and avenge the crime, and you have the very famous painting by David, which shows the intervention of the Sabine women, which is the painting of Hercilia. It's in the Louvre, in between, with all the women and children and babies, in between the two armies, the Romans and the Sabines. And supposedly there was this reconciliation and everybody got along. Historically, that's really not what happened. The Romans really wiped everyone out. But that's the myth. And so we updated this myth in the 1960s, and the choreographer that I worked with on 89 Seconds, a great dancer and choreographer named Claudia de Serpa Suarez, who I said, wouldn't you like to do a fight choreography? Wouldn't every, choreographer want to do a fight choreography? And so we thought, first we were just going to do the fight scene, and then we realized we really had to address the whole myth, and then it became this kind of operatic 5-act thing. I'll show you a little teaser from that, because it's an 83-minute piece, but this is, when we did that rehearsal, what you saw there were about 40 people on a tennis court. I got our main cast, and as many friends so I could pull their kids out of school, and it was winter, it was January in 2005. And we realized we needed to do this fight choreography rehearsal, and we needed people to be able to fall down and not get hurt, and we couldn't do it outside. And we couldn't even really do it in a gymnasium. We couldn't do it any place with a hard floor. So I realized the place to do it was on a clay tennis court. And I got permission to use the Prospect Park tennis courts, which are clay courts, to do this fight choreography rehearsal. We didn't end up shooting there. We shot stills there, but we didn't use it for the main film. We just used it for rehearsal. But there you see a still from that rehearsal, and there you see part of a relief of a sculpture that's in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. But the Rape of the Sabine Women, as Steele pointed out, is based around this 5-act structure. It sort of follows a theatrical structure or an operatic structure. The culminating act of the piece is before the fight scene, which is the end, the sort of decrescendo of the piece, is this heyday of Rome, which we put allegorically into this international style house in Greece. And so there we have our Sabine women as 60s wives, kind of the trophy brides, and the kind of better living through design type of architecture, and that whole thing where people were really first being sold a lifestyle. And so it was, again, another kind of be careful what you wish for kind of myth, in that in the end everything falls apart. I'll show you a bit of that in the teaser. I'll show you some of our references. This is the Bobby Kennedy's political campaign from the 60s, and this is one of our actresses, Tena Spazaka, a very well-known Greek actress, and Maria Callas and Onassis. And then this was actually a still from our final fight scene that we shot at the Herodian Theater in Greece. And the piece starts out, though, the 5 acts. First act takes place in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, where the men are kind of delivered this history back to them. And there's the convening of the group, and that takes place at Tempelhof Airport. Again, the use of architecture, and so this kind of monumental brutalist architecture built by Speer for Hitler. The abduction of the women, which is sort of the central part of the myth, where women are stolen. We shot in the meat market in Athens, and we shot in the working meat market. And then the heyday of Rome, metaphorized in the International Style House in Greece, and the final fight scene, which takes place at the Herodian Theater and also on a football field in Hydra. And so I'll show you a little clip from that. Actually, before I show you that, I'll show you one of the side pieces that we created. As well as making the main film, I usually make a bunch of auxiliary works. And so this is this is an excerpt from one of those pieces called Tempelhof Takes 5 and 7 that I think is kind of nice. And again, this was a continuous take, but you're just seeing excerpts here. Action! Action! Second act, which in the film it's different than this. This is a piece that from this material we created the second act of the movie, but it's again a choreography, and it's again working in a way so that people are doing things in unison, and they start all kind of repeating the same actions. In the actual piece, the piece doesn't cut. This is excerpts. So you'll see they open the newspapers together, they all cross their legs together, they all check their watches together, they all start smoking at the same time, all the men have taps on their shoes. What you're seeing is take 5 and take 7. And so sometimes you think you're seeing the same piece of film repeated. What you're actually seeing are a group of people trying to do the same thing twice and failing at doing that. And I'll show you now just this is one of the short trailers for the actual film, just to give you a taste of how those locations were used. So I'm going to jump ahead because we are going to run out of time. I'm just going to show a couple stills from another installation piece. And this was a piece that was built at the same time that we were creating white on white algorithmic noir. A number of the things we did was sort of research the space program, the space race and the Russian space program. And to do that research, one of the things we did, we got invited to the Moscow Film Festival with Rape of the Sabine Women, and so we took a side trip to Star City, which is where they train the cosmonauts, and as well as American astronauts and astronauts from all over the world. And of all the things you see there, the centrifuge and the tanks where people learn about zero gravity and all these machines and stuff, the thing that kind of interested me, or really sort of fascinated me, was Yuri Gagarin's office. It's been locked down, museumified, kept the same since the day he died in a plane crash in, I think, what was 1964. And so it is its own thing. And so I took a lot of photos of that office, and this is one of the snapshots I took of the office. And then in the same way that in 89 seconds we created the space of a picture, I decided it would be nice to sort of have this space. And so we created the space of the picture. In this case, instead of a famous painting, the space of a photograph that I shot. And so this is the Yuri's office installation that I first showed in a small gallery in Chelsea a few years ago, and then has traveled since then to Vienna for a show, to Texas, and it's one in Montreal in May. And we actually built that office and cut it in the same way that it is cut in the photograph, and forced the perspective in the same way the photographs have forced perspective. So nothing really has 90-degree angles, everything's kind of 87-degree angles, and built all the things that were inside that photo. And then used it as actually a set to shoot in, as well as showing it as an installation piece. So it is part of this thing, white on white algorithmic noir, that I'm going to show you a little bit of, and then I want to talk to you a little bit about another project that I've been involved in more recently. White on white is a film that edits itself live as you watch it. The way that I can demo, it plays on two screens. One screen is a film screen, kind of like that, and one screen is a smaller screen that plays the metadata. As Cecile pointed out, there's 3,000 clips, about 80 voiceovers, and about 150 pieces of music. All the voiceovers and all those film and video clips are tagged with keywords or metadata. Those tags line up, that's what the algorithm does, and they create the edit as you watch live. So for me to demo it for you, I'm going to have to change a couple of things, but I think we can make this work. It doesn't run perfectly on the laptop, but I'm going to try to make it work. And so the beauty of demoing this live in a situation like this, or any situation pretty much, is I never know what you're going to see. And so this. And now you're getting to look behind the curtain in a way that the audience doesn't usually get to. Normally, if you see this in a gallery setting, it's just running, or even in a cinematic setting. We've shown it at Sundance and a number of other film festivals. Okay, so what you're seeing here is the metadata, and that would be installed in the movie theater or the galleries. If you're in back, maybe you want to stand up, or if somebody maybe wants to read it. I don't know. I did actually a pretty nice radio interview where the radio announcer, where Kurt Anderson read the code screen, and he has such a sonorous, poetic voice. Having him read the code screen was great. So it's editing live as you're watching, and we'll see what we see.
So how long have you been in the region for? Lonely? Which question would you like me to answer? Well, you know, do you miss home? Miss those kids you used to teach?
No.
And I'm going to just go overtime by 2 minutes, Steele. I want to talk about one more thing.
You can go over more than 2 minutes.
Okay. I want to talk about one more thing. There you saw, it was, that was a cut I've never seen. It was just, it's editing live as you're watching the movie. And so it's creating a completely different order of storyline and clips. Kind of like that very first thing I showed you, where I had the two Super 8 films and the text in the middle, but with a much more high-tech, complex mechanism and much more material, obviously. On that hard drive, there are something like 30 hours of clips or something. Bring my desktop back, sorry.
How long would it be if the whole thing were to run?
It's kind of a mathematical impossibility because there is no
looping,
whole thing.
it's
Well, it's not looping. It's playing algorithmically, and there is no loop. So it's picking a voiceover, editing to it, picking another one, but even if you sat for 3 or 4 hours, I mean, there's 30 hours of material. There's maybe, if you watched all the voiceovers end to end or listened to them end to end, maybe it would be 4 hours. But if you sat for 4 hours, you might not hear them all because it doesn't pick them in any order, and it doesn't and it may repeat one. And so I want to just talk a little bit about collaboration because in the last year or so, I've been collaborating with my partner, who's also a great artist named Simon Lee, who I hope will come here one day and talk to you guys. We've made a bunch of things together. One of the other things we've done together, actually, I'll show this very quickly. This is a piece that Simon and I did together called Bishkek Balconies. It was shot in Central Asia. A lot of white on white, if you didn't guess, was shot in ex-Soviet Central Asia. We got invited back by the State Department. Total propaganda trip because our most important air base that flies into Afghanistan is in Bishkek. So they want people to like Americans. So every now and then they'll send some artists there and teach kids, or in this case, young artists. They weren't even kids. At that point, Simon and I also decided we'd make a piece ourselves. We made this piece called Bishkek Balconies. It's a video piece. I don't have a clip of it here, unfortunately. That's just a still. And so these facades are continually changing and morphing. And they were kind of an investigation, again, of this very strange kind of Soviet brutalist, very geometric architecture mixed with this Orientalist idea that was something we had never seen before. And then what happened is everybody imprints their own individuality onto it. And so that perfect brutalism, that perfect geometric architecture becomes like this patchwork quilt. And then we made an even more strange patchwork quilt on top of it. But speaking of collaboration, one of the other things we've been doing is in our loft in Williamsburg is running a little theater. This is called the Wallaby Oyster Theater. We can seat about 45 people a night. And we do a couple of shows a year. And it's been really a platform for some of the actors we work with to do stuff that they're interested in. And a way to start experimenting beyond filmmaking, but with live theater, which has some very different kinds of moments to it. And so in this context, we've been acting as producers. We have, other people have been directing, other people have been picking even the pieces that we've been doing, with us signing off on them, obviously, as producers. And we've been just trying to make it all come together and bringing the technical stuff to space, creating the sets, and making it happen. But then the extension of that, in terms of being producers, is that we have gotten involved with these two people, Jack and Lee Rupi. They have a very colorful background. They were in jail in Australia for about 12 years for insurance fraud. They used to create quite complex films and videos and photos and portfolios that were used to defraud insurance companies. And so we got to know them through a friend of their lawyer, and then we started talking to them about some of their work. And one of their works was, let me just see if I can show you. Works was a photo that they created in, let me just see if I can make this. Oops. Oh, shit, sorry. That didn't work. One of their works was that photo that they created in the 70s as part of a portfolio of evidence that was used in an insurance claim. The actual film that was created at the time just doesn't exist. But what we suggested to them, and then they directed and we collaborated as producers, was to recreate that film. So we shot with them. This is a teaser from what they directed back in August. It has yet to be edited. But this is a couple of dailies from what they did and that Simon and I were the producers of. Sorry, you guys. Whoops. What am I doing? That was really dumb.
Back to it. That's back?
Yeah.
Which bag?
You don't have that back?
No.
Let's get to the. Which bag are you talking
Yeah,
about?
that was this morning. I had a hard day at work.
Take it back
I don't feel like
to
doing
the
it.
girl with the red shirt.
Amazing to have a
Someone told me to give it to the girl with the red shirt. They just told me to get rid of the bag.
Right here?
Name was on top of it.
Right here?
Yeah.
Okay, that's right here. I'm supposed to try to meet something here, and I found this. Okay.
Yeah, no problem. You shouldn't be lost.
I'm on my way to meet a friend. I'll see you.
Never bad. Sure. Sorry.
Here? Coming soon? Right here. My son says to give this to you. Here. Yeah. Yeah, that's all. You know what it is? No. You? All right.
Did you give it to her?
Yeah, I did.
Did she say anything to you?
I forget.
I don't think she said anything to me. If she said something to me, it was nothing. Nothing. She said, I gave it to her. Did she say anything?
She asked me if I knew.
Did she say anything? I heard you talking. Did she say anything?
I thought you were kind of nervous. I said, you know, nervous.
You have to look inside. Don't have to worry about anything. I just want to make sure.
Well, you know, when you're nervous, I'm nervous. And it doesn't take anything to make me nervous, so you should know that. I don't need this aggravation. It's hard. Watch out! Let's hit that guy.
You know that guy?
I don't know him. That guy really almost hit him. I think
You know she
I think
said
there's
she was
something
leaving.
wrong.
She's pretty.
Leaving? What do you mean leaving?
Did the girl tell you she was going to leave?
Well, she did leave. She left. I gave her the bag and she left. All right.
But she's still right
We're going to
there.
the grocery store.
That's
And I think we'll feel a lot better. There's air conditioning in the grocery store.
Ashley's.
I know it.
too hot.
We need to get a
She
tune-up.
seems to be leaving. Maybe she doesn't know. Maybe we should get that back. We'll get the bag back.
All right.
Maybe you should just get rid of it.
I think next time I'm going to drive.
Just get rid of the bag. Make sure you throw it away. I don't want to see it.
It's big. You know?
Consider it.
That's what he says. You're going to be getting internet. I'm a better driver than you are. I am. Yeah.
Wait. The bag?
Billy, what's going on?
You got that bag? No, that's hanging in the room. There was a bag that someone told me to give it to that girl in the red shirt.
Again?
There was a girl in a red shirt.
Yeah, well, it's easy. On a hot night like this, all I have to do is heat up the frying pan for the bacon,
Bill Russell.
the mayonnaise.
Dark jacket. And then he said, just give it to the girl in the red shirt. So I got rid of it.
Oh, I don't know. I'd rather just go home and take a shower.
I know, I just saw it leave. I don't know where she went.
Why are we stopped?
Just want to get my car washed.
Yeah, kind of.
Really all I want to do is get my car washed. I'm really sorry. I don't know.
Hustler boots? Yeah.
I gotta get out of here.
All right. Okay. All right, yeah, hurry up.
Bag I'm here for? Oh, you mean that bag? That's the bag I need. Well, some guy told me to give it to a girl in a red shirt. Sure. Yeah, girl in a red shirt, that's what he said.
Okay, so maybe we can have some lights. So that was pretty great, right? Yeah. I wanted to see more of white on white. But yeah, it's like.
I mean, it runs forever. That's the problem. Yeah, it was installed like a year ago in Chelsea, and it was there for about 6 weeks. I don't know when it'll be in New York again.
So we thought that we would maybe just talk for a minute or two, but if any of you guys have questions, by all means, I think that's really what this part is about. It's sort of about an opportunity for you guys to talk to Eve, sort of poke around at what she's doing, kind of find out what's on her mind that you haven't heard, hear more about what she has said. But as I was kind of doing my own sort of research, I came across this great quote of Eve's, which she's referred to, which is basically that she says her work has a lot to do with surveilling everyday life, and that all of this work, I mean, even sort of Alcazar, which has this kind of, I don't know, sort of mythological, or the Sabine women has this sort of mythological, distant, other time, other world, right? There is still an element of the everyday and the sort of continual.
Well, the banality of it all.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, even if you're in the Spanish court, I'm sure it was completely banal at the time, right? I mean, it doesn't seem so to us, but I'm really interested in that banality and the banality of gesture and how that gesture implies narrative, or how just a little bit of text can also imply narrative, or how narratives can get confused.
So that in some way that, I mean, even though you're in these other narrative spaces, there's a reference back to, in a sense, some version of a daily life that we could all relate to, right? I mean, you're sort of connecting the.
I would hope so, yeah. I mean, that would be the goal, right? Or one of the goals is, you know, that there's something about taking that cinema verite aspect about filming, that notion of filming, and using it for things that are not necessarily verite, right? That aren't necessarily real, and so that there's a whole, you know, style of filmmaking from the French New Wave on that does that, you know, and I'm very intrigued by that, and how you sort of play with how we imply what's going on without necessarily drawing out what's going on in a sort of spoon-fed way. In the way that we're used to with sort of television or mainstream cinema. Right,
because there's so much abstraction. I mean, even in that last piece, which, as you said, you're producing really
we're
more
producing
than.
And they were directing, but they certainly have plenty of input.
I mean, all the shots are these sort of kind of tight shots. A lot of them are sort of telephoto-ish, and you're seeing little bits and parts of people, and one thing sort of spreading into another. Or
yeah, and we're helping Jack and Lee edit it, and it's, I mean, as I said, those were just rushes from the dailies, but there is certainly a lot about implying stuff in this case just through all this multiple voice stuff that's going on, and less through a conventional edit.
You guys, let's.
You have your hand
By
up
all
the
means,
back?
Jessica, come on.
Hi. So for White on Light, the algorithm noir, those are all edited clips in which you then applied an algorithm to?
Well, no, the clips vary from anywhere from, say, 10 seconds to 5 minutes long, and the edit is created by the algorithm.
How did you make those decisions for the clips?
The same way you sort of pick selects when you first start editing a movie. I mean, if you start out, I mean, the thing about editing a feature film, right, is maybe you shoot 100 hours and you throw away 98 of those hours. And it actually seems like such a shame. And so I've tried to think about ways to get around that, right? I mean, I'm not saying all 100 hours are good, but maybe half of it is good, or a third of it is good, or has some characteristics that are worth watching. And so in this case, maybe there's a third of the material that we shot is there. And so the clips are there, and they vary in length. The algorithm is deciding how much of the clips you're seeing, because the algorithms, I don't know, you probably couldn't see the code screen, but every time a tag comes up on this code, on this metadata, it's going to edit. It's going to make an edit at that tag point. And so it's deciding how long, when to make that edit, depending on how much space there is between tag 1 and tag 2. If there's 30 seconds of space, that clip is going to be on the screen for 30 seconds, even if it's a 5-minute clip. If there's, and between voiceovers, it picks a random number, and then it'll play a clip maybe for 3 minutes or maybe for 10 seconds. And so how the film lays out is different every time.
What was the process of creating that algorithm?
I work with a really interesting editor named Kevin Mesman, who edits, mainstream feature films, and then much more strange stuff. Like, he also works for Laurie Anderson. He also works for Todd Solondz. He works for a lot of people, but he's got a really interesting background in that he's got a computer geeky background and a literary background. He studied literature. He didn't study filmmaking, and so we took a really kind of literary approach to it. In that, first we thought, well, what if we can just, I thought a lot about editing, right? And there's a sort of hierarchy of the editor in American filmmaking that actually isn't true in European filmmaking. The editor in the history of American cinema is really up on a pedestal. I mean, you think of Walter Murch and these famous editors. And I have huge respect for those people, and I love conventional editing, but so much of what I think happens, even in a conventional edit, it happens by luck. It happens by chance. You put X next to Y, and suddenly it's really resonant, and you don't quite know why. And so at first it was just this desire that Kevin and I both were interested in trying to experiment with. Well, what if you could just take all these clips and slice and dice them and throw them in a timeline and just see what happens? But that's actually very labor intensive. And so then the question became, well, obviously a computer program could do this for us so much more quickly and efficiently. And so at first, the very first iteration of the algorithm wasn't algorithmic, it was randomization. And it just threw clips up there, and at random lengths and stuff. It picked a random number between, say, 5 and 90, which was your seconds. It threw clips up there, and we sort of watched them. And at first, the randomization seemed really exciting. And there is something on my website that actually is doing that. There's a tic-tac-toe kind of game thing. It's not a game, but it's a bunch of clips that play in a 9-screen version, and it's just randomly putting clips up. And you can watch 2 screens or 9 screens or 5 screens. But then we realized, well, the randomization wasn't quite enough, and we had started writing these voiceovers by then, and some of the voiceovers were in Russian, and some of them were in English, and we realized that we were going to have subtitles. And so then we realized there needed to be rules to it. There needed to be an algorithm. And by then we were working with a young programmer named Jeff Garneau, who just went through many different iterations of the algorithm to figure out how to drive this thing, to figure out how to make it do that metadata querying, which is the same kind of querying you do if you go to Google and type in dog and get a million pictures of a dog, right? But we're doing it locally instead of via the internet. And we're doing it based on these storylines, based on these narratives. And so in that way, it gives you these different edits all the time, and those juxtapositions are often quite uncanny because our tagging was uncanny. We used not a completely obvious form of tagging. I mean, some of what we did was obvious, and some of it was more metaphorical or more poetic or emotional. I mean, there are psychological tags in there. There are words, there are color tags in there. There are tags for camera movement. And so, but basically what it's doing is going through these voiceovers. We've tagged the voiceovers, we've tagged all the footage, and it's creating the edit based on matching up those tags.
But to clarify, but there are choices obviously made about what you were shooting in the first place. And one of the algorithmic noir, there is an element, certainly watching, I guess nobody has seen the whole thing perhaps, except for you. But there are definitely elements of narrativity that are, it's not just the inevitable one thing after another or that makes that happen. There are sort of the seeds of story in there.
Yeah, well, the seeds of story are sewn into those 80 voiceovers. And those 80 voiceovers have a number of different stories. There's a story about this man who ends up in this city A, which is this part, and there's a job interview going on, which is part of what you heard just now. A sort of futuristic retro noir city that
Alphaville.
Very obviously a nod to Alphaville and a nod to the sort of that, the utopian Soviet ideas of building these places in like the mid-century modernism, and which on one level kind of worked on a utopian level, right? Like everybody had housing, everybody had health care, everybody got educated, there was nobody living on the street, and so that was the city of the future in 1950 or 1960. The main location we were shooting was a place called Oktau, which is a tiny little city on the edge of the Caspian built by the Soviets in the early 60s. And it's all numbered. So it's like being inside a circuit board. Your address is 36112 or 41525. So there's no street names. So it really is sort of this perception of the kind of digital age before the digital age had really taken hold, and before that was common for everybody's thinking, that everything was numbered.
You seem to have a very consistent soundtrack across your films, like the way the noise, the white noise across white products. I was wondering if that was a premeditated decision that you stuck with for consistency purposes, or if it was just something that...
Yeah, I don't do almost anything premeditated. I'm very much not a premeditated person. I think
it really drastically affects the ambience of everything. It kind of puts
yeah, I do. There are, like I say, there's this core group of people that I've worked with for a while, this Rufus Corporation, and that certainly has probably affected my aesthetic. There's a bunch of musicians, I do a bunch of writing, but there's also some people who are really good improvisers in terms of both dialogue and sound. 89 Seconds and Rape of the Sabine Women were both scored by Jonathan Bedler, who's a very well-known composer. He scored all of Matthew Barney's movies. But the crowd of musicians that have worked with him have been friends of mine for a long time. And so, there's not, I think when you work with a group of people, you do have an aesthetic, and that aesthetic starts to come back and inform what you like and how you think about sound. And certainly in helping Jack and Lee edit The Car Wash, we're definitely talking about it more as a sound piece than as a film. It's a cinematic piece, obviously, but it's not really a cinematic edit, it's more of a sound edit. And the Mike Figgis film, you ever see, Time Code? One person? I actually think the film drives me crazy, but it's one of the most amazing sound edits you could ever watch. I think the film is kind of annoying and stupid on a lot of levels, but as a piece of film editing, as a piece of sound editing, it's just incredible, and so you all should watch it, because it has also that multi-layered thing going on.
And there's so much ambient sound. In a lot of your work, where you're bringing, the whole Alcazar. There are these people talking, right, but they're not using words. But you're so aware of the rustle of clothing, right, and the kind of the movement of.
My directive with that, and as I said, I worked with a composer on that, sound designer, composer, and my directive on that was you should make it feel like the room is breathing, like the room really has to feel like it's breathing. And Like, so you feel the energy of the room. Like, what's the psychology of the room? What's the energy of the room? What's the tension of the room? And that's conveyed a little bit through film and a little bit through gesture, but it's conveyed much more through sound.
Up on the floor. Yep.
The more recent work from like Alcazar forward seems to all be set in different periods. And I was wondering what the interest in that was, the kind of setting things in the past.
I'm a lot older than you guys.
No.
You think a lot more about your past. What? I'm not 300 years older, but I am probably like 30 years older. I mean, certainly the setting of Rape of the Sabine Women in the 60s was really important to me and to the folks I was working with. It seemed like an obvious place historically to set that myth for so many reasons. I mean, there were like all the gender issues were coming up at that moment. It was also, I mean, I was born in the 60s, and I have a very good sort of photographic memory of the 60s and 70s. And that is a point historically that we can remember through photography. That even if you weren't born then, even if you weren't alive then, you know what it looks like through photography, through magazines, through the media. And so when you look at those mythical stories and you see like these big budget Hollywood movies, and they're done, you know, like you take Troy and you do it in sort of this Roman period piece, right? They seem ridiculous. They seem like parodies of themselves. And no matter how well they're done, no matter how much money they throw at them, first of all, they have everybody speaking kind of with a British accent, English. Well, what the fuck? Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry. Those people, no, they didn't speak English, and they certainly didn't speak it with a British accent. So what's going on here? And so, you know, those like sword and sandal costume dramas, you know, I just kind of couldn't go there. But then when you think about that myth, it just fits so much, that idea of the sort of mid-century dream that was being sold to people and has been sold to people pretty much since then, but it's taken kind of a different form. I think there really was this moment where the utopian idea and better living through design and the idea of the perfect wife and the perfect house and the perfect hairdo and the perfect clothes was more real for people, more real than it is now. And that was the moment that I grew up in. And so, and I do think it is still great design, and it's still great fashion, and it's still, you know, it's still visually very resonant. But because of the gender wars, because of the idea of the early 60s being so caught in this both design, architectural, and kind of sexual idea of how people behaved, right? That just seemed like an obvious place to set that myth. And then in terms of working with Jack and Lee, we're basing that on a photo of theirs that was shot in something that we think is 1975. And so that was very much about being true to that. Was
that a scam that they were perpetual?
They did a bunch of insurance scams. They got very good at creating these portfolios of evidence for insurance losses, and that they would do for clients. So if somebody needed a painting to disappear, or if a car suddenly had to get wrecked, or if somebody wanted to liquidate something because they needed some cash, but they didn't actually want to get rid of the thing, Jack and Lee would create that portfolio of evidence, and they got real good at it, and then they actually got a little sloppy. They robbed their own house in the late 90s, and they were living in Australia. They were actually born in the US, but they immigrated to Australia when they were quite young, and they got busted for robbing their own house.
They couldn't drop charges?
They screwed up. You know, they got a little too cavalier. They got a little too good at it, and weren't careful. And so they got the book thrown at them, and a lot of their prior evidence against them came to light.
That so often happens.
That so often happens.
Anybody else? Yeah.
I guess I have a question about 89 Seconds. Just about, several kind of questions, like your choice with the actors. When you were sort of talking about it, it sounded like you wanted to do a sort of surveillance kind of style take on behind the scenes of the painting, but the actors were clearly directed to be very kind of, they were performing in this very direct way. It was sort of dreamlike. They weren't speaking lines. They were adopting these very sort of classical poses. And, it felt as though there was a kind of an intentional level of theatricality to it. It was very.
Oh, it was completely theatrical. Yeah.
And then I wanted to ask, why, in that sense, did you not like what was the intended separation between the money shot of like the actual painting and then like why didn't you have them standing right? Why wasn't the dog flipped over?
You mean why wasn't it actually?
Yeah,
why wasn't it actually locked into that moment of the painting?
Yeah.
It's a good question. I'm really happy it didn't turn out that way. Although, to be honest, I think we probably tried. But, you have 11 people and 2 kids, both under the age of 7, and a dog. They're actually going to do what they want. And so there's a point, even though, it doesn't have any of the spontaneity that you pointed out, which maybe it would be a better piece if it did. At this point, I would look back and say, oh, maybe to do it the way you pointed out would be better. But because we did want to hit that moment of the painting, and we tried. We did 11 takes, it was shot in one day. And I think what you realize, in a way for me, I really thought the piece would absolutely be uncut. It would be one continuous circumnavigation of that space on a Steadicam, and the only cut would be to take the end back to the beginning, which would be done on the wall, so it would be an invisible cut. It took me 6 months to realize that I would have to make 4 or 5 edits, and then it took me like another 6 months to decide what those 4 or 5 edits would be, because for the very reason that we really did have this choreography, and we wanted to hit that moment, and so people do have to move in and out of that moment, and actually to have it be resonant, it has to happen rather slowly. And I didn't want to do a lot of stuff with slowing down the footage. I wanted it still to be somewhat real-time action. And so to have, for instance, people suddenly just be backstage or out of character, or it would have been very different. It would have been really dropping of the fourth wall, as they say in theater, right? That we would have the sort of fiction of it would have fallen apart more. And in some ways, the fiction of it started to be kind of important. Although I probably didn't think it through even as I don't think I thought of it as something where we could ever like just have the actor say drop out of character and then suddenly drop into character and become that. And there's something I think that is actually resonant about having them kind of be these theatrical, fictitious characters, even though it's kind of campy and it's actually not that well done costume drama for 11 minutes or whatever it takes. But it was, a lot of effort was put into hitting that moment, and ultimately that's impossible, and the impossibility of that is actually, for me, what's successful about the piece.
That's what's intriguing, yeah.
In the same way that even with that Temple House piece with the guys walking in the airport, the impossibility of them repeating the same take twice the same way is also, that failure is also, I think, what makes that piece work. That initially when you start, you think you're just seeing the same 2 clips next to each other, and every now and then they line up, and most of the time it's impossible to do the same thing twice. Just like it's impossible for us to replicate Las Meninas.
No.
So do you think there's a relation between theatricality and surveillance, or do you see like a connection there? Because it seems to be 2 like large themes when watching the videos. You have kind of the sound is amplified and everything, but you have a surveillance feel to it. Is there like a...
In a way you'd think there wasn't, right? They sort of seem like the polar opposites.
Right.
But I think there's no reason that you couldn't take, or you can't take that surveillance aesthetic that I certainly started out with, and bring it into a theatrical context and see what happens. And it changes a lot the theatricality. Certainly what I've learned by running this little theater, which we've been doing for about a year and a half, is it's, the surveillance aspect never can happen live. When live, you just see everything at once in front of you. The idea that you're just seeing the minutia, in a way, isn't really possible unless you start actually like this famous Dutch theater director, Ivo van Hove, has done a piece where he recreated Cassavetes, one of the Cassavetes films, maybe Shadows, or I forget which, one of the Cassavetes films, Opening Night. He recreated Opening Night as a piece of theater, but kind of also as a piece of surveillance. So you see the theater, you're in the theater, I saw it at BAM, you're in the theater, you see the entire film done as a play, and then up above the actors, you see the movie that he's cutting live of the actors with these really close shots and really tight things. And so then the surveillance thing and the theatrical thing are brought together in a way that was pretty amazing and pretty resonant. And I have to say, in that instance, it was definitely the marriage of surveillance and theater, which, yeah, they're kind of polar opposites, but that's all the more reason to try to bring them together.
But it's also this sort of cinema verite aspect of, people like Godard, or that sort of, which had a kind of already that surveillance was informing, or I don't know, that idea of looking from that kind of distance was informing or abstracting.
Right.
I'm sure there are other questions.
Anybody else?
Another one. Sure.
What?
Sorry, I have a couple. I was interested in why, or what the impetus was. You said when you were discussing your work, you wondered why nobody had a company, and so then you made a company.
Oh,
but it seemed like there was.
Oh, there you are.
What?
You could come over here.
That's cool.
It seems like I imagine there was more of an impetus, and it seems like before that you worked fairly independently, or the people that you were working with were not at the level of collaborator, like for the ornithology piece or other pieces. So I wondered what the shift was, and it actually turns into a very dramatic shift when you think about a piece like ornithology, or you think about a piece like Rape of the Sabine woman.
Well, I mean, in a way, it's sort of true and not true. Because even with, there were a bunch of pieces I didn't show. I did a piece called River Blindness that was these huge mirrors hung off the side of a garage, a big parking garage. I did a bunch of big installation pieces that, even though they weren't attributed to a group, they entailed quite a bit of collaboration. Because you just can't do those big installations or shoot these big kind of cinematic type things without a team, right? Or without bugging all your friends to help you, right? And you end up like exhausting all your friendships. You can do that in your 20s and even get away with it in your 30s. And then you hit about 40 and your friends are gonna start dropping off, Like you realize you sort of have to get more professional about it. But I also I think the change, we say, when did that change come? I actually, in 2000, I went to Berlin and worked for a choreographer named Sasha Waltz, who's kind of the next up-and-coming Pina Bausch. She's very, very famous in Europe and does these big dance theater pieces. It's where I met the choreographer who was one of her dancers that I work with now a lot, and a lot of great performers, some of whom also came and did the Rape of the Sabine women with us. But that was where I kind of got the first taste of, this is what it's like to work with a company. They have huge money for that in Europe in the way that we don't in the US, especially on that experimental level. Here, if you have companies, it's like, New York City Ballet or Martha Graham or maybe Worcester Group, okay? But, our avant-garde companies are not supported the way they are in Europe, so you get to see, like, you go and you work for someone in Europe in a company situation like that, and you're like, holy shit, this is so cool. Everybody's getting paid, you can make a middle-class living, and you go to a studio all day and play around. And so it seemed there were definitely a lot of enticing things about that made me think about the company model. Of course, it's really unsustainable in America unless you're really, really super successful. But it's not that people here in the sort of experimental world don't have companies, they just can't pay everybody. Or they can't keep everybody employed. Like in Europe, people are actually under contract and they're employed. Here, I can have a group of people that I go back to time and time again over the last 8 or 10 years, but I can't keep them on salary. If I have a grant or if I've sold some work for that project, I can pay them. And so there are those same core group of people that I have turned to more or less since 2003 that make up the kind of core group of what I call Rufus Corporation. But yeah, I got infatuated with the company model. And then there's a lot of things about it that aren't great at all. But I also started to understand that if you are going to make these big collaborative works, whether they're installations like Ornithology or the River Blindness piece I did or whatever, they require that you do lean on other people a lot. And I felt like there needs to be a way to attribute that isn't just your name. I wanted to take it away from my name completely, and to sort of, you can't give credit necessarily to 10 names all the time or 100 names, or the list of names keeps shifting a little bit. But like I always insist that we credit the company, like in the wall text of a gallery or a museum, or that if we show at a film festival that we have a program, kind of like you do in a theater, and so that the company gets credited. But yeah, there was a shift because I went and worked for a company and I understood what that was about.
Maybe this sort of ties into, I don't know, maybe we have time for one or two other questions, but the whole question of operating within the art world. In, you know, what, a minute and a half or less, but...
Okay, a minute and a half.
No, I mean, it's just, I mean, here, the work is tending, for all its installation aspects, there's a strong filmic component and storytelling component, and the art world doesn't generally work that way. Doesn't work so much with narrative, doesn't work so much with story, and definitely doesn't work so much with this sort of long-form film quite.
Well, I mean, with the big exceptions that most of us all know about, right? I mean, like Matthew, like Shireen, like, you know, there are people who have made longer form cinematic work. I mean, Doug Aiken, Ayeli Satila. I mean, there's a lot of longer form cinematic work out there. So I think the art world's getting more used to it and has gotten more used to it over the last 10 years or so. But that brings up the subject that you and I talked about previously, which is, you know, the history of video art comes sort of out of the history of performance, right? And performance artists filming themselves, right? That a lot of that early work in the 70s especially was about people who were doing performance, turning the camera on themselves and making those video pieces that worked from that kind of core impetus. And my interest has been more in the history of film. And so, and also the history of architecture and the body in architecture and gesture and choreography. And so that brings you back to these more performative pieces that suggest narrative. But I don't think the art world is that, I don't know.
Inhospitable,
or
unsupportive.
Not that inhospitable to it. I think people will show, you know, eventually, I think if you just keep pushing, you know, there
boundaries
so many
between
different
film
trends
and
now that you can't, everything, there's sort of a space out there for everything. And, you know, and just when I first started making things that were a little bit cinematic, I thought, oh, should I apply to film festivals? And that just seemed like an utter waste of time. And then I started getting invited to film festivals, and I was like, oh, well, if you're going to invite me, then I'll go. And that was a whole other kind of ball of wax. And at first, it was like so refreshing. I was like, wow, people really want to sit here and talk about the work, and nobody's really trying to sell anything except these like big, you know, feature film people. But if you go to these more experimental festivals, I started going to festivals in Poland, where they're really, really like crazy work. You know, they have a history of super out there work. And, you know, their film business is supported by the government, so it's like they have a different patience, a different idea. They'll sit there and watch James Benning films for 3 hours, which are great films, and we should all sit there and watch them. But that's sort of the history that I was more tied to.
One more, maybe? Anybody? Or not? Oh.
It seems like you're thinking so deeply about narrative, and this kind of follows up with what you were just talking about. So I wonder, like, what you're watching and or what you're reading and thinking about these things in terms of, like, particularly white on white, like this disjointed and reformulated narrative.
What I'm watching and what I'm reading. I mean, the references for that in some ways are like all the sort of the film geeks will like start spewing off all of the film references there. Like obviously Godard, obviously Tarkovsky. But actually, in the art world, somebody who I think is awesome is a guy named, and I might be pronouncing his name wrong, is Zebrin Versteeg. And he's super interesting. He's also a computer geek. I mean, he writes his own code. And he's made a couple beautiful, he's made a lot of beautiful pieces, but he has a couple of pieces that edit live from the internet, and they're phenomenal. They're just so great.
Maybe you should spell his last name.
Versteeg, I think, it starts with like V-E-R-S-T, either E-E-G or E-I, or I-E-G, but his first name is Zebrin, S-I-E-B-R-E-N. He's got like a Scandinavian sounding name, but I think he's American. He shows at the gallery in Chicago. And his work, I think, is just incredible. I mean, in terms of like cut up narrative, you know, it's not like I was reading tons of Burroughs or something. But you know, one of the things that I think I think about this now that you bring that up, and I wasn't thinking of it at the time, but I'm sure it's lodged somewhere in the back of my memory, is when I first moved to New York in it was probably 1984. I first moved to New York, and somewhere in those first couple of years I was in New York, I went to a performance of John Cage reading from his diaries, and it was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. It was totally incredible. It made absolutely no sense until the very end, and then it made complete sense.
So maybe that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much, Eve.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.